Hello, everybody, and welcome to this opening session of the 21st International Conference on Cultural Economics. My name is Trine Bille, and I'm professor at Copenhagen Business School and president-elect for the ACEI. The theme of the conference is culture policy. This theme was actually planned before COVID-19. But with the cultural sector being among the most adversely impacted from the current pandemic, the focus on culture policy seems even more important. In this opening session, we have two prominent keynote speakers, and they will give their reflections on cultural policy and the importance of research in this regard. The first speaker is Elenore Belifore, and she will talk about the role of cultural policy research in a post-pandemic world. Ellie is professor of communication and media studies at Loughborough University in the UK. She has published extensively on cultural politics and policy, and among many other things, she is the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Cultural Trends that many of you will know. In her keynote, Ellie will speak about the role of cultural policy research in the project of building better politics for arts and culture instead of just going back to the pre-COVID-19 situation. The second speaker is Professor David Throsby, and he will speak about the relevance of cultural economics for culture policy. Can we do better? Probably we can. I'm sure everybody in this audience know about David Throsby, but I will give a proper presentation of David before he's going to speak. This session will run for 2 hours. Ellie will have about 35 minutes to speak, and there will be room for short questions in the end of her presentation. Then David Throsby will speak, and at the end of the session, there will be a common discussion with Ellie and David, and it is possible to ask questions. Unfortunately, it's not possible in this format to ask questions live, but you can post questions in the Q&A function. And then together with Bronwyn Coate, I will curate the questions and I will read them loud to David and Ellie. And there will probably be more questions and comments that we will be able to handle. But then after the session, there will be the option that the speakers can give written answers to the questions. So with these words, I want to welcome Elenore Belifore as the first speaker. Welcome, Ellie.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let me just share my screen so I can get my slides seen by you. Let's just see if I can do this smoothly. So hopefully you're able to see my slides now. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the privilege to open such an important appointment in the research calendar for our field of cultural policy / cultural economics. So I hope with my intervention to facilitate the opening up of what I think is an important conversation which people who are involved in this event need to be involved in, because we need your perspective and we need your contribution, and we need to come together at this challenging time as a community to think about the future. Hence my title, which I will explain the origin of, Build Back Better, What Role for Cultural Policy Research in a Post-Pandemic World. And I have to make a confession that when Trine invited me to do a keynote for this event, that's when I chose my title. And I think in hindsight, probably talking about post-pandemic world was a little bit optimistic. And I don't think that we can still or yet say that we are in a post-COVID or post-pandemic world. This might well be coloured by my own experience of living in the UK, which is certainly not COVID-free or post-COVID. And indeed, a lot of my observation will be based on the UK, because that's the reality I can see every day and I'm closer to and I know better, but I suspect that there's a much broader relevance here. And so the elephant in the room, or the thing that I hadn't really anticipated when I thought about my title, was that actually we're not really yet in a post-COVID world. We're very much in a COVID reality still. But I think we are at a point in this unprecedented historical time where we feel we can, we have moved away from just the trying to be in survival mode and trying to see this crisis through, to beginning to think about the future and what comes after COVID. And there is certainly in the UK, but I've seen also certainly in Europe, this kind of sense and an increasing popularity of the rhetoric that it won't do to simply go back to how things were before the pandemic, that we don't, that returning back to normal life should not mean going back to how things were, because how things were was problematic. And in a sense, what COVID has done, it has highlighted a lot of the tensions, the problems in society, to a degree that now we can't pretend that we're not aware of them. So if we want to build back the world, but in a better version of its previous self, then what would that kind of project look in the arts and cultural sector, in the creative industries? And I think what I wasn't sure until last night whether I wanted to do or not, was to actually give very much a normative slant to my presentation. But I think the times call for a value-driven vision plan for the future, and I think actually there is very much need for a normative framework for future cultural policy research. And so I have decided to go for it, and I have and I will conclude this presentation with my personal proposition for how we might think about a different way of doing things in the future, which is inspired by an ethics of care, and particularly the thinking of Canadian scholar Jean Toronto. So this is kind of an excursus of what I am trying to cover in my half an hour. But let me explain the title of my presentation and why Build Back Better is in quotation mark, because it is indeed the title of a relatively recent strategy document that the British Treasury, so the equivalent of the Ministry of Finance, published in March 21, which was meant to be a strategy to get the UK economy back on track after the freezing effect that lockdowns even have had on it. And in the introduction to the strategy document, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote, "We must grasp the historic opportunity before us to learn the lessons of this awful pandemic and build back better, levelling up across our United Kingdom and fixing the problems that have held back too many people for too long." So a recognition there that apart from the inevitable impacts that COVID had on the economy, on society, on people, on public health, that there was a sense in which the way that COVID impacted different communities, different parts of the countries, had to do with pre-existing inequalities and differences. So, this expression building back better has become common parlance in UK policy discourse. But there's also a sense that in March 2021, the Prime Minister seemed to think that we were in a situation where we could learn lessons from something that had happened, and clearly thinking that we were out of it, or out of the worst of it. But actually, the COVID pandemic is not over in the UK at all. In fact, following partial ease of restrictions in mid-June, rates of infection have increased significantly by a quarter in a week. Cases of people tested positive have increased by over 50%, and whilst deaths haven't, increased proportionally, more people are dying. So I think it's safe to say that it's a bit premature to talk about, certainly at least the UK being in a post-COVID situation. Although sadly there are statistics for several countries, not just in Europe, but worldwide, where similar negative trends are happening. I know that last time we spoke to David Throsby when we were planning this session, he was at home in lockdown. So clearly we're not out of it. But what has the policy response been to this situation? So the relative ease of restriction in June, that meant that cinemas could open, theatres could open, even though with massive restrictions and limitations and regulations to prevent to protect the safety and the health of punters. This was just the first stage in a summer of easing regulations. And at the end of the last month, even though we knew that the numbers were moving in the wrong direction, there was a commitment by the government to continue on their path of easing up restrictions and opening the economy up, and making sure that the hospitality industry and other industries that had been affected could try and go back to some level of activity. And so who is the Minister for Health, Sajid David, said at the end of the month that people and businesses need certainty. So we want every step of this easing to be irreversible. Make no mistake, the restrictions on our freedoms must come to an end. And there was much of a rhetoric about personal freedoms having been curtailed, where bizarrely by freedoms, freedom of not wearing a mask seemed to feature prominently in the political rhetoric. And at the end of June, he said, with the numbers heading in the right direction, all while we protect more and more people each day, 19th of July remains our target date to open up and ease restrictions. Meanwhile, while the Public Health Minister seems more concerned about restarting the economy, more and more people are getting ill. So I'm sorry that I'm starting with some rather grim statistics, but you can see here a totally unsurprising picture of what's happening in the UK as restrictions were eased ahead of Christmas. Number of cases went up quite dramatically. They equally went down dramatically as the country was into lockdown. And as soon as restrictions were gradually eased, we have a spike in cases again. So it's quite clear how this works. The more people mix and the more they are able to move around and do stuff, the more the contagion spread, which quite frankly is how you expect a virus to operate. So it's not particularly shocking. There's no big revelation here. But certainly that made me think about what the UK government means when they talk about building back better. So there was an announcement just not even 48 hours ago, whereby the Prime Minister confirmed plans to lift many limitations from July 19th onwards. And this has been received well also by the cultural sector, because it will mean less restrictions, people being able to socialize, and there's some hope that this will encourage people to attend venues again. Even with the ease of restrictions, data shows that the British public is not keen, has not rushed back to theatres, cinemas. There's a lot of anxiety, and there is a concern in the sector for sustainability. However, some of the rhetoric around this ease of restriction, I think, has been troubling, with both the Health Minister and the Prime Minister suggesting that Britain needs to open up again, and Britain must learn to live with the virus and learn to accept that people will get ill and people will die, which of course has resulted in a backlash from people who, for whatever reason, are among vulnerable groups, who feel that they are being cast as potential casualties of the focus on regrowing the economy. And I would query to what extent this kind of approach really equates to building back better. Incidentally, because I know that there are a lot of cultural economists in the audience, you might be interested to also hear that, incidentally, in the Build Back Better report by the Treasury, there wasn't even a mention of the arts and creative industries. So, this is, there's no significant indication that consideration for the cultural sector have been part of this plan or the thinking behind this idea of restarting the economy. So this being the current political climate and the current frame within which debates around the future of the cultural sector are happening in the UK, I would say that this is not the approach that I would want to advocate in terms of how we go about building back better things in the creative sector. And in fact, what the rest of my talk will do is actually produce a radically different, opposed, in fact, from the point of view of values, to the one that our political leadership is offering. And I think it's fair to say that the part of the reason why we need to come up with alternative visions for the future, not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that the one I'll provide now is the only one or the best one, but we need to think in terms of alternatives. It's because one of the things that has become clear with COVID is that at one of the most challenging times in recent history, globally, we have, with some notable exceptions, we have witnessed really a global level lack of real credible political leadership. And the incompetence and the timidity and the corruption of too many leaders have led to too many avoidable deaths. On top of that, if there's one thing that is clear certainly crystal clear from the data that's coming out of the UK, but I'm pretty sure that it's the same worldwide, judging from a number of publications on the topic that we have hosted on cultural trends. One of the clear impacts of COVID has been to heighten, to worsen pre-existing inequalities in society, whether it's inequalities of health, of wealth, of opportunities, and also of opportunities to protect oneself from the virus. And ultimately, it's true that the arts and cultural sector have had to endure a particular heavy blow and have been particularly affected by COVID, alongside the tourism and the hospitality and the food industry to a degree by what has happened. But ultimately what's happened in the arts and cultural sector is but a small part, is a snapshot, is a fraction of what has happened at the broader societal level. So some of the impacts that I will enumerate and illustrate in a moment are just part of a broader picture of deepening inequalities. And I would suggest that if we really are keen to building back better, the idea of which I am quite in favour, even though I am very much not convinced that the UK government's route to doing this is a very sensible one. But if we really mean, if we really have a genuine commitment to building back better in the arts and cultural sector, then this project cannot be seen in isolation and as separated from the bigger task of acknowledging the damage that that COVID has caused, acknowledging that the damage, what I call the wounds of COVID have not been felt equally across the world, across different social demographic groups, and that this will, this has to be taken into consideration, and hence why I think now is the time for unapologetically normative vision and approach to both making cultural policy and researching cultural policy. And on this last point, my thinking is very much still in the course of developing. So what I'll put to you are some preliminary thoughts that I hope will feed into the conversations that you have for the rest of the conference, and debates that are happening in the social space in the conference, and just opening with some encouragements to think boldly about the future. So a lot of the snapshot around what I think the situation that we're presently facing in the arts and cultural sector is, again, drawing on the UK, but with broader suggestions of relevance, is based on research that we have published in Cultural Trends. So as a new editorial team who took on the helm of the journal in January 2020, and so we very much, our tenure at the helm of the journal has pretty much coincided with the COVID era. We were adamant that we wanted to be a space where scholars, practitioners could come together and just think about where we are, what the problem is, just share evidence and begin to think about what happens next. And particularly one of the most read, downloaded articles have been part of a special issue that Mark Banks and Justin O'Connor have edited for us on arts and culture in the viral emergency. And I think what I really find helpful is the way that they frame the question of making sense as scholars of what's happened, and maybe I like their framing so much because I think that when they talk about the warnings of Cassandra-like scholars, I suspect that they, they might mean me too. But what they say is that of the current situation is that it has revealed where we stand in terms of how and whether even we value culture. So I'll just read this quote because I really like it. So they say in the editorial that opens the special issue, the warnings of those who Cassandra-like had suggested that the economic rationale for culture would be badly exposed when that economic reality was actually tested came to pass in many places. In the UK and Australia explicitly, in other places implicitly through inaction. The advice to cultural workers was find a job that pays. For the boosters, the answers was to double down, be resilient, develop new business models, go digital, build better relations with the consumer, develop your tech. And to illustrate this, I've got here an actual poster or an image from a digital Mostly campaign by the UK government in response to the employment crisis or unemployment crisis that resulted from the economy shutting down for so long, and particularly the arts and creative industries. So really closing down pretty much across the country and pretty much, from one day to the next. And so they had what I can only call a sort of campaign to encourage people to think creatively about their future and reskill so that they could be more employable in the future. And so they had this image of a professional dancer, a woman of colour, I would add, suggesting Fatima's next job could be in cyber. She just doesn't know yet. And there was such a public outcry, not just from arts and cultural workers, but actually for once, the general public too felt that there was something so intensely patronizing in suggesting that somebody who has devoted decades probably to training into an art form like ballet, and in this case a woman of color who probably would have had to go through double the hoops to finally be able to be a professional dancer, should just retrain in something completely different. So the dismissal of the training, the expertise, the sacrifice, the years, and the levels of sophisticated skill that a professional ballerina would have really rankled, and even the public was outraged to the point that the government had to they got rid of this from their campaign, and they apologized. But that gives you really a sense of how little understanding, respect for the kind of skills and levels of training that arts workers have on the part of the government, who unsurprisingly wasn't very effective in supporting these workers in the moment of crisis. And again, Banks and O'Connor, in their contribution to the special issue, makes some really important points, I think, and worth thinking about. And they argue that what the COVID crisis showed and have really cast into the light is how we think about and value art and culture, how we argue their importance, or indeed we dismiss it, how governments and public policy understand and value them, what they're prepared to do to support them, and how. And they also are very critical of the advocacy machine that sort of tried to resist these kind of simplifications and try to make the case for the sector needing special support, a rescue package. And they, they suggest that the accounts of reactions and impacts of COVID in different parts of the world that they have collated for their special issue all speak to the damage wrought by the pandemic on livelihoods, institutions, the inadequacies and often degradation of ways of speaking about arts and culture, and how any new language of value must be part of a fundamental rethink, not just of the purpose of art and culture, but of their connection to the values of a wider political economy and ultimately politics and a common ethos. And where I really agree with them is that thinking about how we build back better in the arts and cultural sector post-COVID needs to be part of a wider discussion of the kind of society we want to live in, needs to be part of wider debates around political economy, politics, what kind of economic systems we want, and also this idea of a common ethos, a common set of shared values that we want to live by. And so this is kind of, these are the lines along which I have been thinking. And just for context, some of the statistics or some of the, just to give you a sense of the depth of the wounds inflicted by COVID. Again, these are some UK data, but there's plenty of data now emerging from other geographical places. I'm sure many of you will be presenting papers on aspects of COVID impacting on the creative economy. And indeed their special issue covers a lot of geographical ground. But one thing that emerged quite quickly in the UK was the extent to which after much begging and advocacy, finally the UK government did release a support package. But it was very much a package that was intentionally actually focused on helping cultural institutions, and particularly the prestigious cultural institutions on which the tourism industry and the prestige and the soft power of the UK is based. And there was it took a while. It happened eventually, but it took a while for the government working with the Arts Council to find a way to support freelancers in the arts and creative industries, which of course, it's a major problem in an industry where freelancing is a really prevalent mode of employment. So there were various kind of schemes. Well, there were two main schemes, one for the support of self-employed workers, and one for supporting companies, employers in following their staff, neither of which really worked for the kind of employment prevalent in the sector. So a large proportion of arts and creative industries workers were effectively ineligible for any of the initial recovery schemes. It took a while for the government to recognise that there was this group of workers who somehow had fallen through the gaps of both schemes. But we're talking about BECTA, which is the union for people working in the film and TV sectors, saying that about half of the workers in that industry had access to no kind of support other than minimum welfare support, which is really not really enough to live on realistically. So massive impact across the body of the arts and cultural workers. And what was really interesting, if a bit worrying, was that in the immediate response to the pandemic, which in the UK, like in many other countries, I'm sure, saw lots of sector organisations surveying their people to find out what the impact of COVID, of the first lockdown had been, what the most immediate needs were, what the greatest concern was, and Communion in England, in one of the, I think the first COVID article that Cultural Trends published, did a sort of critical review of the various survey that were that had been carried out or were live in the sort of summer of 2020. And they noted how very few of these surveys were actually asking people about the background. They weren't gathering demographic information, which seems to suggest that they hadn't clocked, or they hadn't particularly given much thought to the possibility that COVID might impact different kinds of art workers in different way, and that there might be some groups who might be more or more badly impacted than others, especially women, disabled, ethnic minorities. And indeed, they raised this alarm, I guess, quite early on, and their concern were in fact borne out by the data and the statistics around on impact as they started to come in. And I won't, don't worry, I won't read through all of this, but you can certainly listen, in fact, or read Doris Aikoff article on cultural trends, on focusing precisely on the impact that COVID would have for workforce diversity and inclusion. And she was, so this was published sort of second part of last year. So again, Doris looked at what we knew about the dynamics of work in the creative industries and the data that was beginning to emerge. And she again raised an alarm, because what she saw as the inevitable measures that the sector would take once, to try and recover from the impact of COVID would be all measures that would be, very predictable, but also likely to impact most negatively women, disabled people, ethnic minorities people, but also socially, non-middle class, well-connected people, because she was saying things like companies will be less likely to hire people on permanent contracts or long contracts. They will be more likely to have people on a freelance basis, on a short contract, because they're cheaper, they're more flexible. They will, salaries and rates of pay will go down, and there won't be money to advertise roles, so people will over rely on their networks, which means that if you're not part of those networks, you might never hear about opportunities, and all those all those small wins that have been made might see a step back. So, the way in which the sector have made a commitment to move away from unpaid internships, all those commitments might take second place now. And indeed, the data as it's emerging confirms that there is an unequal impact of COVID on the sector. And interestingly, the same is not just at the level of cultural production, but also at the level of consumption. So the Centre for Cultural Value at University of Leeds has been running a COVID-19 participation monitor, looking at how engagement and participation has been affected by COVID. And you won't be surprised to hear that very much here as well, the impact of COVID has been just to heighten inequalities that were pre-existing. There is some interesting data around digital participation, how digital participation has been rising exponentially for Black and minority audiences, and for disabled audiences, which clearly is an interesting thing to reflect on. But largely here too we have an an equal impact. So, having said all of this, if we reject the notion or the approach to building back better that the government has chosen, which is to focus on economic growth, to acknowledge that the most vulnerable in society will just have to learn to live with the fact that we have a highly infectious disease spreading and causing long-term health damage, if not health. And I think what my suggestion is, as I have said, is I think that we need a strongly ethical vision for how we want to build back or rethink the way things work in the arts and cultural sector. And here I have found great inspiration from the work of Mark Banks, and particularly his book on creative justice, where he focuses on cultural work. I think a lot of his message has much broader significance, and he invites us to think in terms of the moral cultural economy, and therefore on a perspective that focuses the attention on the normative environments which ground and connect different individuals, institutions and structures. And what I take this to mean is we need to ask questions about the normative environments in which arts and culture are produced, consumed, supported by policies and funding schemes, and decide whether we think those normative environments are acceptable or are moral, and whether we can in fact make them more equal and just. And so what would then a just approach to cultural policy making and researching look like? And there are, again, some questions that Mark asks in his book, which I think are a good starting point. And he asks, what kind of values or actions might underpin a fairer or more just cultural work? So if we wanted to somehow address the even starker inequalities in working conditions for different kinds of workers, how would we, what kind of values would drive that kind of action? What kind of better working lives do we want to imagine or help create? And again, he's talking about creative workers, but again, I do think that there is a broader dimension to this question, and that we might want to ask the same question of all kinds of workers, of which art and cultural workers are a part. So I'm conscious of time, and I hope I've not gone too much over my 35 minutes, but I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So I felt that I needed to leave you all with something positive rather than just doom, gloom and criticism of the UK government, which quite frankly is just, it's an easy shot. And I guess my personal, the place where I am looking for that normative foundation for cultural policy and for cultural policy research. So very much I say these things as part of my own process of dealing with what we are living through as a researcher. I've found great inspiration in feminist ethics of care scholarship, because it represents a fundamentally opposite approach and foundation for thinking about the future and the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of policies that we need to what the current government is showing us here in the UK. And the central focus of the ethics of care is on the compelling moral salience of attending to and meeting the needs of the particular others for whom we take responsibility. So in an ethic of care vision, such as the one presented here by Victoria Held, who's one of the ethics of care most prominent theorists, is valuing emotions and values and sympathy, empathy, sensitivity, responsiveness. So what I like us to think about is what would be a cultural policy that was focused on a vision of care, or cultural policy as a labour of care, look like? After all, the objectives of cultural policies are to look after, care, protect arts and culture, the products of human creativity, the people who produce that creativity, the people who enjoy and participate in that creativity, those who don't as well. And it's about caring for particular art forms, it's caring for the maintenance of heritage, of culture, of creative expression for future generations. So to me, it seems to me that there is already an assumption that caring for things, people, creative forms is already part of how we understand cultural policy. So I think, to me, this seems like a reasonable fit. And Jean Tronto here presents, this is a quote from her book from 2013, was titled, like, Escape Me, Apologies, where she sort of talks through the various phases of care. And what I really like about this identification of different moments, different key stages of the process of caring, and the ethic and the moral qualities that are attached to each of those phases, is that it focuses on responsibility, and in this idea that care starts from from seeing the needs around us, recognize that somebody, or in our case, an area of policy, or a form of expression, or cultural workers have a need that's been currently unmet. And also the caring for, the taking of that responsibility of meeting that need that is currently unmet. And then again, finding the competence of doing something about it and making sure that those needs are met. And this is not just a competence in a technical sense. There is a sense in which wanting to care properly for that for which we have assumed responsibility is a moral act, not just about whether you are able to do it or not. And then also the final stage is care receiving. Once things and people are being looked after, they'll let you know if the care was adequate, what other needs might have emerged, and then how we respond to that new need, to the response to our act of care, is also a key part of the way in which we care. And I do wonder whether hidden in these 4 moments there is a plan of action for arts and culture, but also a plan of action for society. And of course, then the bigger challenge, and I don't have any solutions here, is how do we operationalize this? How do we turn it into not just a nice set of ideas and ideals, but also protocols, procedures, policies, and how do we implement it? And I'm not going to lie, I don't know, but I think it's worth spending some time thinking about that, which is what I'm doing at the moment. And asking questions like, what would an arts and cultural funding system driven by this kind of ethical framework look like? But also something that has been at the centre of my concern for a long time is, what is our role as scholars of cultural policy, as scholars of cultural economics in this sort of vision? Do we just observe what goes on, or should we actually ourselves recognize the need for care and become active agents in this mission to reshape our society into a more caring one, or at least try? And this is totally a rhetorical question. So of course, I think we should get stuck in as scholars. I think the scholar that just objectively looks at reality unfolding is maybe an outdated model. It certainly is a model that I felt never worked for me. So for me, there's no dilemmas here for me, but I can see that there's perhaps discussions and debates to be had. And how do we push for a caring approach in the arts and cultural sector, but also in society more generally, in very uncaring times? Living in the UK in 2001 and 2021 feels like living in very uncaring times. And with these big questions, I end. So with no easy solutions, but I hope you didn't hope that I would come here and tell you how to fix it all. I would be always very wary of people making that kind of promise, but I hope that we start a conversation, and I hope that you would want to include me in the conversations that you have around this. And that's me done, Trine. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen so that Trine can step in. Is that work?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Ellie. You actually spoke for 15 minutes. 50 minutes.
I'm sorry.
I
tried to monitor, but I wasn't really able to see the moment. I do apologize.
No problem. I think it was really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed your talk and your concept of care. I think that's one to carry with us during the next days. I'm sorry, but I don't really think we have time for questions to your speech, but we will have questions in the end of the two keynotes. So I want to go directly to our next speaker, which is Professor David Throsby. And David, you are professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney, and you have really been recognized for your research in cultural economics during decades. And you were actually the man that got me into cultural economics, reading your book from 1979. So I think you are well known among this audience. And since then, you have published many books on economics and culture. Latest, the economics of, or maybe not latest, but you have published the economics of cultural policy, which is really relevant for this session. So David, I will give the word to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Trine. I hope you can hear me. I hope everybody can hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here, even though it is only virtual. It's unfortunate, of course, that we can't meet in person. Those of us with long memories can remember many biennial conferences of the Association for Cultural Economics International, going right back to the, well, really in my case, going right back to the 1970s. So it's a long, long time. And there have been really some terrific meetings in some amazing places all around the world. And I know that we were all looking forward to meeting up in Lille last year in France, and also again this year, perhaps. And I know that Luc Champerneau there put in a lot of work into trying to get to give us a good time, and unfortunately that didn't happen. So, well, we have to be thankful to the wonderful technology that we have access to now, and at least that enables us to be able to participate virtually, if not in person. So look, I would like to thank, first of all, to thank Trine and the association for inviting me to give a keynote, and I'd also like to acknowledge Ellie's a really interesting lecture which she has just given, and I'll come back to some of the forward-looking questions at the end of what I want to say. In some respects, we're in the wrong order because she's looking forward and I'm in a way looking back. Because my topic is really the intersection of cultural economics and cultural policy, how we've got to where we are now as economists looking at questions of cultural policy. I should say that I mean by cultural policy, I'm meaning public administration, government policy, policies which are formulated at local level, regional level, national level, international level. There's an international discourse on international cultural policy, mainly led by, by UNESCO. through multilateral treaties and so on in the cultural arena. And so there's a lot happens there too. But I'm talking essentially about national, local, national and national cultural policy formulated by governments. That, of course, isn't the end of the definitional question, because we need to say how far does the cultural in cultural policy extend. In cultural economics, as we know, we tend to think of culture in both the functional sense and the constituent sense. That is, in the functional sense being the ways in which we use culture and produce it and consume it. And that has been traditionally the domain of cultural economics over all the years since it really became established as an independent and definable discipline. But in recent times, there has been a widening, I think, of the scope of cultural economics to include more interest in the constituent sense of culture, meaning ways of life and group values and so on. And so, in fact, that is reflected perhaps in the fact that nowadays, sometimes the field is referred to as the economics of art and culture to indicate that sort of broadening out of interest. But to turn to my presentation and my title, let me just see if I can share the screen. There it is. Let's see if that's going to come up. Share. Yep. I think that's worked. Amazing. Hang on, full screen. Where's that? And from the beginning. Hooray. I have, as you can see, my title is The Relevance of Cultural Economics for Cultural Policy. Can we do better? And in order to decide whether we can do better, we really need to know what we've managed to do. Where are we now? And so let me give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I should say, incidentally, that my PowerPoint is much duller and more boring than Ellie's. My PowerPoint skills don't extend very far. I'm pretty good at bullet points, but that's about as much as it is. And so I don't have lots of pictures and so on. So I apologize for that in advance. It's very boring, but I hope you don't find what I have to say boring. The question is, as I said, if we want to ask, can we do better? We need to know what we're doing now. And I'm going to do that initially and rather briefly. To compare the two discourses, which I can define as cultural economics, which is what we all know, and cultural policy studies, and ask how much work in cultural economics is concerned with policy, and how much work in cultural policy studies is concerned with economics. The field of cultural economics is peopled mainly by economists, mostly, not always, but mostly, and the tools and methods that we use are mostly derived from the discipline of economics. Cultural policy studies, if there is such an amorphous sort of collection of scholars, is a bit more difficult to pin down, but it tends to be more engaged with sociological issues and the humanities rather than strictly with economics, of course, deriving particularly from areas like cultural studies, sociology, and so on, and is more interested in social impacts rather than economic impacts, and that's fair enough. It does make these two quite separate fields. Now, the best way, I think, to find out what's going on in these two fields is to look at what's published, and to do this, I did two things. The first was to have a look at, to do a sort of content analysis of the contents of the three journals in the field, which are the Journal of Cultural Economics, which we all know and love, the International Journal of Cultural Policy, and Cultural Trends. That's the journal which Ellie mentioned, because she's a co-editor of that journal, Cultural Trends. It's a terrific journal. Well, I suppose all those three journals are terrific journals. I should say that because I'm on the editorial boards of all of them, but they are all involved in some ways, quite directly, with questions of cultural policy, and therefore they're the ones I had a look at. And if I look at the top five topics that are covered in articles published in last year, 2020, in the Journal of Cultural Economics, it mirrors pretty much what we do. We look at demand, we look at exchange, we look at markets, we look at supply, and also there are articles there on trade and on labour. And that pretty much reflects the distribution of topics or subject areas that we look at in cultural economics. In cultural policy, or in the International Journal of Cultural Policy, urban and regional got the top spot last year, but you will also note, and you'll also notice that in cultural trends, demand and consumer behaviour is also at the top of the list. Slightly different sort of orientation from those in the Journal of Cultural Economics, but nevertheless, that's what they were concerned with. And labour, of course, and that's reflected to some extent on what Ellie has just been saying, a lot of concern about the nature of cultural work and cultural labour. But you'll see also that there is a connection between, or a sort of common theme running through these three journals of creative industries, creative and cultural industries. And so and so that's something which I'll come back to in a minute. The other thing that I did, I did two things in this sort of content analysis. The first was looking at journals in 2020. And the second thing was I took two of those journals, the Journal of Cultural Economics and the International Journal of Cultural Policy, and I looked to see whether there was any trend over time in the ways in which these subjects have been the subjects of research in these fields, research and publication. And I should say straight away, well, there's a table, and that's my only table. I put the table in just because it's nice to have some tables in the presentation. Everybody loves to see tables, but please note that these data are very preliminary. This is a fairly cursory look at the content of articles in these journals, and I'm going to redo this stuff sometime and sharpen it up a bit with a more detailed content analysis. But for now, the way in which I did it was to have a look at the frequency, at the occurrence of different words in the title of articles. How many articles had the words industry or industries in their title? How many had arts, heritage? And I took those four, industry, arts, heritage, and urban or city sort of issues. And the things that you will see in that table, I won't go through it all, but some things that are interesting are, first of all, the fact that that arts remains a constant in both of those journals, and that's not surprising. That's always been in one form or another, the creative arts have always been one of the major sort of areas of interest of both of the fields of cultural economics and cultural policy studies. If you look at industries and cultural industries and creative industries, you'll see that it's quite remarkable the way in which it has increased in the International Journal of Cultural Policy from the first decade of this millennium to the second, to the most recent, a doubling of the numbers of papers in the field of cultural industries, and reflecting, I think, to some extent, the ways in which there has been a focus on creative industries and cultural industries, which I'll say something more about in a moment. And the other two that are down the bottom there, heritage and urban, both of those have shown increases in both of the journals over the period that we've been studying, particularly heritage. As you'll see, there's been a tenfold increase in the International Journal of Cultural Policy in the articles published in the field of heritage. And so that's really quite an interesting thing that's the case. But what I want to do now is to take out three areas where cultural economists have made a contribution. Now, this is fairly selective, of course, because cultural economists have made contributions across a huge range of topics, and this is very much sort of selective, and there are many that I've left out. But the first of these is creative and cultural industries. Now, I put that first because that really is the one which has created the most sort of interest, and it's the area where there's the greatest overlap between cultural economics and cultural policy studies, as we saw from those previous numbers. And this notion of cultural creative economy has become something of a contested site. We know very well the origins of the discourse about cultural industries or creative industries. It sort of goes back, well, it does go back a long way. Sometimes it's sheeted home to the cultural policy statement that was put forward in Australia in the early 1990s, 1994. But in fact, of course, there'd been quite a lot of discussions about industry in one way or another in the way in which economists talked about arts and culture in the years before then. But I think probably we would agree that the time when it really achieved its sort of strongest and most concentrated policy focus was in the UK with the creation of the Creative Industries Task Force in 1997 by the newly elected Blair government. And this is usually taken as being the sort of stimulus to thinking about the creative economy around the world. And in fact, it was very much and clearly related to the economic benefits that come from arts and culture. It was said that the creative economy was a subsector of the macroeconomy where containing industries where output, employment, exports, and so on were all growing much faster than in other sectors of the economy, and so therefore it was, useful or important for governments to pay attention, and because they could contribute very strongly to economic growth. And this proposition sparked interest all around the world, really. And so most countries now, if you look around the world, you'll see that many countries do have, in one form or another, a creative industries strategy or policy. Certainly in Europe, there's quite a that's there in and in other countries as well. Most countries have a set of creative or cultural industries, which they refer to as that sector. It differs between different countries, but more or less it's much the same, and we know what they all are. And so when this happened, and when the creative industries started to be absorbed, as it were, into the cultural policy discourse, it was seen as being, to some extent, a takeover of the cultural policy discourse by economics, the sort of economization, if you like, of cultural policy. Up till that stage, up till the mid-1990s, cultural policy had been mostly concerned with arts, policy towards the arts, heritage, education, arts education, and so on. And in the current millennium, it's increasingly become focused on creative cultural industries, and this has been seen as being a takeover by culture, by economics, and the ghosts of Adorno and Horkheimer have been resurrected about how this is the sort of the end of culture. It's the ultimate sort of commercialization of culture for which we all pay a price. Now, of course, economists certainly contributed to the process of development of cultural policy, of creative industries policy that contributed to this. But much of the criticism of economists which has been made is based on a misunderstanding of what economists, I think this is true to say, as a misunderstanding of what economists actually did do, and the characteristic of economists as sort of Philistines who were interested only in monetary outcomes, or were all sort of neocons and neoliberals who just wanted to replace everything with markets, it is somewhat far-fetched. Now, it's interesting that although it's true that the economics of the creative industries have tended to dominate in the policy discourse, to some extent, in the academic discourse, the boot is on the other foot. In fact, if you look at the ways in which the academic discourse about creative industries has developed, you could probably find more sociocultural, socioeconomic cultural studies sorts of attention to the creative industries than, and this relates particularly to creative labour, than there is about sort of strictly economic interest. And let me take as an example to sort of illustrate this point. Have a look at the recent volume that was edited by Kate Oakley and Justin O'Connor, both eminent scholars in their own right. It was the Routledge companion to the cultural industries. Now, being a sort of comprehensive volume, you would think that that would give a pretty good snapshot or a pretty good overview of the sort of context or the sort of content of what's going on in cultural industry studies. But the blurb for that book says that this is a collection of contemporary scholarship that seeks to reassert the importance of cultural production and consumption against the purely economic imperatives of the creative industries. And so that, I think, that's as if economists haven't been concerned with cultural production and consumption. But I think that sort of emphasizes the fact that in some quarters at least, the contribution of economics hasn't been very significant. In fact, has actually been to some extent pernicious because it's only about purely economic imperatives, which, as I said before, I don't think is in fact the case by any means at all. The book's contents of the Oakley O'Connor volume's contents are mainly contributed by people from political economy, from sociology, and from cultural studies. Not much from economics. Now, please don't get me wrong. I would hasten to say that there's a lot of very interesting material in this book, and economists should read it, and a lot of us do, and take account of the broadening of the scope of cultural policy which is contained there. I just object to the suggestion that it sort of replaces the way in which economists might approach the subject, but certainly it's indicative of the way the policy discourse has shifted in recent years, and that's really the reason why I mention it. It's indicative of the way in which the policy discourse has moved, as I've said. So, okay, what can we claim that we as economists have contributed to the discussion about the cultural industries? Let's have a look at where economists have made a contribution. This is not in any particular order of importance, I suppose, but I think it is true to say that economists have contributed a lot through showing the ways in which the cultural sector is constructed. It is undoubtedly and can't be denied to be an economic sector. And so to show how it fits into the economy and how the relationships exist and the networks exist between different components of the cultural sector is really quite important. And we use things like input-output analysis, which is a well-established methodology for doing exactly this. And I think that has been really useful. And that, combined with the fact that we are good at data. What we need, if we're going to say anything sensible about the creative sector, about the creative industries, is we need sound, objective, reliable statistics. We need good data, and this is something which economists are used to. We're used to working with data, and we know what the various components of statistics mean, and so we can facilitate the supply, and have done the supply, of empirical information. And I've mentioned particularly cultural satellite accounts here, a reasonably recent phenomenon, but something which has turned out to be really quite important in being able to identify more clearly the ways in which the cultural sector is constructed and the ways in which it's empirically it contributes to the rest of the economy. And that is related to my next point, which is that we have tried to make clear the distinction between contribution and impact. People talk about the contribution of the creative sector to the economy, and all sorts of numbers get thrown in here. And that is something which the cultural satellite accounts will enable us, and just the national accounts enable us to quantify more directly, more accurately, rather than the sort of fairly vague and sort of unsourced statistics which go on in saying what the contribution of the creative sector is to the economy. Even more so, we could say this is about studies about impact. We've got, well, we go right back to Bruce Seaman's article of the 1980s, not the 1880s, the 1980s, on impact studies, and that's something which we still see exaggerated claims made about the impact of a festival or something like this. Some very good examples of work properly done by economists, many of whom I'm sure are listening, and these do stand as examples to those who make exaggerated claims, and that's something which I think we've managed to do. In terms of the behaviour of economic agents, that's been a fundamental to culture, for cultural economics, over really all the time that it's been in existence. Non-profit firms as businesses, that dates right back to the late 1970s, the original work on that Trine actually mentioned, the economics of the performing arts. That work goes right back to the 1970s, and also particularly and very obviously work on creative labour, particularly artists. And there's been lots and lots and lots of work on artists. And again, there's been some excellent work on the conditions of creative labour using the tools of economic analysis. And this is not to deny that questions of inequality, of discrimination, of precarity in labour markets, which tend to be the focus of the cultural policy studies or cultural studies work, is in there with the work that economists do as well. And then finally in this list, there's the question of policy instruments themselves. That's something which we do know about. Taxes, subsidies, and so on, and I think that again, that's something which has contributed to the general debate about cultural policy and the ways in which economics can contribute to cultural policy. So I think that the conclusion that I would draw in relation to the creative and cultural industries is to say that we really have to be a bit more open-minded on both sides of this divide. I would think that economists certainly need to be more aware of the work that goes on in other fields that stretches the boundaries and looks at some of the problems which we haven't perhaps looked at sufficiently well. On the other side of the fence, if there is such a fence, on the other side, in cultural policy studies and cultural studies, I think there needs to be more understanding of the fact that in cultural economics, is peopled by economists who don't think that markets are the best way to solve every problem, and are sort of closet neocons or even overt neocons. It's not like that. Lots of economists are, but not in cultural economics. So I think that there just needs to be more understanding and more collaborations and more cooperation. If I can move on to the question of heritage, the second topic which I wanted to draw attention to, this is a good example of a field where originally economists were thought to be Philistines. This, many of you will remember the contribution that Alan Peacock made, our dear and late lamented colleague, who I should say in parentheses was such a supporter of the association and attended many conferences, including the first one in Edinburgh back in, I can't remember when, I think it was 1979. There were a couple of us were there who are still managing to stay alive, but anyway, Alan was a major force in the field. But he wrote the paper. He gave a lecture to the British Association in 1994, which was called Does the Past Have a Future? And in it, he made the sort of rather mild suggestion that maybe public preferences should have some part to play in the allocation of resources for heritage conservation. And it created a terrific storm, and all the cultural and all the heritage professionals got really up in arms and thought that this was just an example of the economists wanting to come in and take over and say everything had to be looked at in financial terms, and that was that. Fortunately, heritage economics has moved on a long way since then, but it is an illustration of the fact that there is sometimes this sort of sense that economics is really narrow and dull. Maybe it comes from the way in which people get taught economics at school. And I remember at school, the kids who did economics were real nerds, and so it may be that it goes back a long way. But the fact is, I think that in heritage economics has emerged as a case where cultural economists have shown that economics can contribute without undermining the cultural significance of heritage. And there's quite a lot of collaborations go on in this field, which has been really, really useful. As evidence of this, let me turn to another book. This is the Handbook of Heritage Economics, recently published, edited by Ilda Rizzo and Anna Mignosa, a big book, 31 chapters, mostly written by economists, but there are some architects, some archaeologists, and so on. It shows in the breadth of papers and topics that are considered by both the economists and the non-economists. It shows the breadth of field and the sort of extent of understanding of the nature of heritage that is characteristic, I think, of the way in which economists have contributed to this field. So what have economists actually contributed? Let me go to my next slide. What have we done? Well, I think we've been quite helpful in terms of concepts, looking at heritage as a tangible or intangible economic asset. That's been appropriate for setting up the basis for considering heritage as an economic good, and then subjecting it to economic analysis. But the thing which, of course, is important about that, and which takes it a little away from the sort of mainstream neoclassical economics, is that it raises questions of value and valuation. Now, this is something which permeates, the question of value and valuation permeate the field that we're talking about, and that was very evident in the sorts of things that Ellie was talking about, because it's one of the most common features, common questions that economists get asked if you say you're working in the arts and culture. Well, what is the value of the arts? People are always saying this, and so they say the same thing about heritage. And so one of the things which I think heritage economics has been very useful, because it sharpens up the whole notion of value and how valuation is carried out by economists. The sort of delineation of total economic value, the distinction between use value and non-use value. Now, I know that's true that environmentalists have done this already, and in some respects we just sort of came along and applied all that stuff to our field, and that may be true to some extent, but I think it's been certainly moved along quite a lot, and particularly in terms of the methods for assessment of non-market values, contingent valuation, discrete choice experiments, now more recently benefit transfer, and other methods for looking at non-market values and working out how these values have to be incorporated into decision-making relating to cultural policy. And that has been also pushed along and facilitated by techniques and tools from economics, namely particularly cost-benefit analysis, in the appraisal of conservation projects, representing conservation projects as investment projects, and they're subject to appraisal by the same means as is applied to any other forms of investment. And that raises for the non-economists in the team who is looking at this, the interesting questions that they may not have thought about before, things like opportunity costs, for example, alternative projects, the question of discounting, something rather hazily understood, and something which economists should be pretty good at. And so that's, I think, is some of the things which have been going on in heritage, which are really useful. And let me just also mention, when we're talking about policy, there's a very nice example, I think, of the ways in which theory and economic analysis can directly contribute to actual policy formation in a project which is going on in the UK at the moment, which is called the Cultural and Heritage Capital Project, being undertaken by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, in the UK. It's having a look at the ways, or it's looking at and studying the ways in which the notions of cultural and heritage capital can contribute, like natural capital has, to the valuation processes that are required for the UK Treasury's Green Book. Everybody wouldn't probably know, even if you don't live in the UK, that the Green Book is the sort of manual for appraisal of, for project appraisal and so on in the UK. And there's been quite a lot of work to incorporate aspects of natural capital into that, into the processes in the Green Book, and this project is looking at cultural heritage capital in the same context. If you want to look further on that, go look up Cultural and Heritage Capital, DCMS, on the web, and you'll find some very interesting and useful reports. The third area which I have mentioned is development. And I mention this because development is an example of a field where the wider definition of culture is relevant. Development processes happen in a cultural context and also in an economic context. And social issues of inequality and discrimination and so on are of particular importance in this field. And so development is an area where economists have quite a lot to say and have had a lot to say. And in fact, if we look at where these contributions have been made, we'll see that, for example, the whole discussion in economic development, in the field of economic development, about how economic growth as a measure, GDP growth, is not a very appropriate one. It's not a very appropriate one for anybody, but it's not appropriate for developing countries. And there's been much more attention paid to indicators of human development, and particularly through the UNDP and the Human Development Reports. And also probably one of the best known economists who's worked in this field is Amartya Sen. His propositions about development as human capacity expansion, and Sen was particularly concerned with culture, and he's an economist of the first class, of course, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he's written about the role of culture in development and the ways in which this can't be extricated from thinking about economic development. In fact, that really does lay the foundations for going on to think about how he did that work many years ago, but it's still relevant today. And I think nowadays there is quite a lot of interest in the cultural industries in a developing country. Here we come back again to the notion of the cultural industries, but in a development context, there are the same conclusions and methodologies. Well, no, the question, I suppose, is, are the conclusions and methodologies to analyze the cultural industries in developed countries, are they transferable directly to the global south? And I think the answer is generally no. That needs a sort of rethink about the ways in which the economic processes of cultural production and distribution happen in a low-income country, and how this has to be taken on board. And that a context in which that happens now is in the context of sustainable development. So the role of culture in sustainable development is something which has received quite a lot of attention in recent years, as many of you would know, particularly with the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, to talk about that would take me another couple of hours, and I won't go there, but it is something which is which really is quite important in the contemporary debate about development, about culture and development, and so on. And then finally, there's cultural trade in the global south, and there's some quite interesting work goes on in relation to cultural trade and equity, questions of inequities of market access for countries of the south, but also other things like cultural diversity and cultural trade and so on. These are all issues which are of current interest to economists, and again, I think we have the capacity to make a substantial contribution there. Now, I'm just looking at the time, and I see that I'm nearly running out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time on the next topic. In fact, the last topic that I'm going to look at, which is governance and administration. Now, I should say, I suppose, before I leave the three topics, I also should say that that those three areas that I chose were chosen for particular reasons to illustrate the points that I was making, but I could have referred to many more. I mean, I could have referred to consumer behaviour and demand, which is one of the most important topics for cultural economists. I could have looked at urban and regional issues. I could have looked at labour. I could have looked at the digital economy, which is a growing area of interest amongst cultural economists. And these are all areas where economists make cultural policy a contribution to policy formation. Many of the articles in these fields may not mention policy particularly in their titles, but most articles would have some statement somewhere or other about at the end of a paper about these are the policy implications. And so there's a policy content in much of what economists do. But let me move on to this question of governance and administration. There are several issues there. I think probably, in view of the time, I'll just skip to the last of them and say something about national cultural policies, because this is the way, in a way, the way in which we bring all of this stuff together. And again, the history of cultural policy statements goes back again to the 1990s. Australia has had one in 1994, another one in 2013. Which didn't get very far because the government was defeated just after it was released, not because of the policy, I hasten to say. And several European countries have explicit national cultural policies. And as I said, it's useful for bringing together and coordinating the wide range of government departments that have an interest in cultural policy. It's not just the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry for the Arts. It's trade, it's foreign affairs, it's urban development, it's tourism, it's health, it's education, and so on. So all of these things. So in a genuine, comprehensive cultural policy, you would really want to bring all of these things together. All of those have some economic content. And so the point that I would make is that economists should be involved in this process. And I would say that in a post-pandemic world, national cultural policies will probably take on a greater significance for many of the reasons that Ellie talked about. And it is very clear that they would need to really broaden out and look at wider issues. And in that context, just to conclude, I'd just make 2 points. The first is that I'd want to make in a sort of post-COVID situation is to say that the pandemic has emphasized the importance of the digital economy, particularly to performing arts, music, theatre, dance, to individual artists, of course, and to cultural institutions, museums, galleries, and libraries, and so on. Now, a lot of this is really just a sort of acceleration, if you like, of things which have been happening already. I mean, there's been a long history of, well, relatively recent history of the adoption of new technologies, if I can call them that, in the arts. And I mean, it's quite a few years since we looked at Hassan Bakshi and I looked at, for example, in 2009 at the National Theatre streaming live performances to cinemas, and there's been lots and lots and lots of stuff has happened since then. I think that what we can say is that that to some extent these are continuing, but they've been very much accelerated and concentrated, if you like, by the occurrence of the pandemic. The question is this going to be a permanent change, or whether things are just going to go back to how they were before? I think there's no question that these things will continue. The acceleration will continue, and the digital online sort of environment will continue to become more important. And with that comes the sort of social and sort of, yes, sociological, if you like, issues about cultural workers and so on that that Ellie talked about, and which I agree absolutely. And we've had the same sort of policy failures in Australia as she talked about in the UK. As she talked about in the UK, in terms of leaving, at least initially, leaving the leaving artists and cultural workers right out of the picture. Finally, the second thing I would say is that cultural economics has studied the notion of authenticity. That is, the real thing is the I'm just going to stop share. Is the access to a live performance, for example, going to continue? The fact that everybody is now sort of listening to their music on streaming, if they're listening to, if they're looking at theatre or so on online, when the pandemic is finally over, are people going to go back to going into theatres, going to museums and so on? I think the answer to that is undoubtedly yes, they will go back to this. Whether in the same numbers as before is not all that clear, but there will always be, I think, undoubtedly, a demand for the real thing. The live performance in the theatre in the same space, or in the music in the same space as the musicians, the same actual physical space, not even at the end of a stream, but in the same physical space. And it's the same for the performers. The performers, musicians, and so on are absolutely more turned on and strive for the actual contact between real people on the stage and real people in the audience. And that's something which isn't going to go away. And the same thing applies to museums. You can look at any number of museums online. It's no substitute for actually going and seeing the works themselves. Okay, that's all I'll say. I think I've overrun my time a little bit. I'm sorry, Trine, but that's it. And thank you very much for having me on. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, David. It was a very nice overview of the contributions of cultural economics. I think I would like to invite Ellie into the conversation. Abin, can you help with that? Hi, Ellie.
Yes,
hi.
I think I've managed
Good to see you.
Come back.
And thank you both. Yeah, before we address some of the questions from the audience, I just want to mention that I think it was a bit surprising maybe that you said, Ellie, that the cultural sector was not really mentioned in the Build Back Better and not visible in culture policy during the pandemic. And I actually think that's the same in Denmark and probably everywhere else. So it is time to rethink culture policy, I think. So the big question is, what can we do as researchers and scholars to address these questions, and what are the important questions to address in research in these times? And you mentioned, Ellie, that how we value arts and culture. is one of the most important questions to address. And I think you also mentioned that, David, in your talk. It's a question we are asked all the time by the sector. What is the value of arts and culture, and how can we deal with that? But I really want to ask both of you, what do you think are the most important research questions to address now? And maybe also a second question, how can we join forces? How can the cultural economics and cultural policy research work together to address the important cultural policy issues? Because they are still a little bit separate fields. And I think to address the burning issues and to rethink culture policy and to inform culture policy, I think we as scholars need to get closer to each other and collaborate to a larger degree than we have done before. So if you want to elaborate on this, it would be great. I know it is, yeah, they're both very big questions. But yeah, what do you think are the most important questions? And yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to start? So, well, David catches his breath. I think absolutely. And I think that actually the second point that you made is how we come together as scholars from different specialism is probably even more essential than the first one, because I think the key questions will remain more or less the same as they've always been, like the value questions and how do you bring it into cultural policy. What I find frustrating is really what David has described. As a cultural policy scholar, it is frustrating that there, even within a relatively small field, there are still almost silences. And so I know that I have in my work historically critiqued the narrow instrumentalization of culture, which a lot of my colleagues seem to interpret as me loathing cultural economics, whereas no, I always thought that cultural economists were the greatest allies, because actually it's been your community who has highlighted the issue with the crassness of a lot of impact evaluation as it's used in policy making, that I always refer to. But that work isn't read enough within cultural policy study, isn't enough, and there isn't enough of a connection. And I think there's probably more in common, and there's so much to be gained from joining forces. So just to give an example, I recently had an article of mine through the peer review process, and I this was an article around the rhetorical importance of the idea of impact in cultural policy making. So and I was citing a lot of these sort of bad economic impact evidence, and one of the reviewers said, well, but why are you being so critical? Maybe this form of evidence are so compelling rhetorically because they're correct. I was just thinking, but what about all the work that cultural economists have done showing this? And so I had in the revision process to add a section which I naively thought was superfluous, discussing all the work in cultural economics that has highlighted the limitation. And then there was the work by yourself, Trine, and recent work with your colleagues in international in AJCP, and work by lots of people whose names I recognize in the participant list. And I was just, and I think I was naive to assume that just a couple of references would do, because we all know what kind of work we're talking about. But clearly not. So clearly cultural policy people don't read cultural economics papers. And maybe that reflects that sort of divide that is happening. But I think that's not how we solve problems. So I think actually they're coming together, they're trying to, and that's why I was so excited by this proposition of having, cultural policy person is very much not an economist of any kind, and two of the most prominent cultural economists we have, I thought that's exactly the conversations that we need to have more systematically. So I think the questions are all, the questions sadly are kind of always the same. I don't think they're going to shift, but we can try and answer them differently and more collaboratively. That would be what I would want to see happening.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah,
what do you say,
yeah.
David?
Look, I can just add very quickly. I think we should. I suppose we should be in violent disagreement here in order to generate some sparks. But I find that I agree with all of that, Ellen. But look, I would say in relation to the question about what sort of subjects do you think, or what sort of topics should be studied in cultural economics, I think that as Ellie said, that people still go on doing what they do. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about this field is that mostly people who get attracted to do something in this field as economists are because they're interested in art in some way, in culture in some way. I mean, it's not that they just sort of see this as an area where there's lots of data and they can start cranking out some results. It's something that they're much more sort of switched on by, and particular areas of that. I can't remember who it was who said, I think it might have been Mark Blaug who once said, that people get attracted into cultural economics because they're interested in art, and art and culture. That's they may be sort of crypto novelists or crypto painters or something like that. But it's true, and I think that will go on. And I think probably one thing I would say is that in the light of the discussion that we've been having, I think that maybe people should be paying our own area of the field in cultural economics to be paying a bit more attention to the policy implications. I mentioned that a lot of the papers do have a section at the end saying policy implications, but that isn't always the case. And sometimes, it's just thrown down. Like, so much of what goes into the American Economic Review, which doesn't get read because it's just, it's all stuff that's all very technically sophisticated and so on. But it doesn't say anything that's going to be useful for any purpose. And so I think we really ought to almost have a requirement that people put a policy implications statement at the end of their papers. The other thing I'd say, though, again, is to say, of course, yes, the collaboration. And I would say that comes from something I said earlier about understanding. I think that we in cultural economics do need to understand more about what's going on in the cultural policy studies field, and likewise, I think that they over there on the other side of the fence need to understand more about what economics going on, economists are. And I think that's we need more of the people who are open-minded on both sides to be able to have that sort of collaboration. But I think, but to finish, I think all of that should contribute in some ways to the collective statement about what can the social sciences, the arts and humanities contribute to cultural policy formation at the national or local level in the way going forward. Mindful and very, very sort of aware of the ways in which the world is different now from what it was before.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree about what you said about the collaboration. And one of our hope with this conference was also, since we have the theme of cultural policy, to attract some cultural policy scholars. So hopefully we will have cultural policy scholars among the audience, and that could also create a debate and collaboration about these topics in the future. But yeah.
Sorry, Trine, this is an idea that came to me as you were talking, and maybe I can launch an invitation to you all, or to us all, well, to you all, because I don't have the capacity to do this. But I would welcome a suggestion from attendance to this conference for a special issue of Cultural Trends on creating that common space to think about how we can bring a different perspective together to tackle the big challenges of the future. So if anyone has the capacity, has clever ideas, I'm all ears. I would welcome that very much. And it's very—
Thanks a lot. That's a wonderful invitation. Yeah.
So I look forward to hearing from some of you.
Great. I think I will go to some of the questions from the audience. We have a question here from Andre. he says, what is the actual relevance of the debates on values of culture for economic modeling of culture policies? Maybe that is for you, David.
Yeah, you know, models are models, and they have to, you know, they do what they can. And it's true that you know, some of the models that I mentioned in relation to cultural industries don't say very much about value, apart from economic value. But I think there is also an effort to have to develop models which are more aware of the cultural sorts of values that we've been talking about. I mean, it depends on the various studies, but I think that that's certainly possible to do that, and some do. Having said that, you know, it is true, yeah, of course, that some and I wouldn't dismiss them. Those sorts of models which do just simply show the economic consequences of this and that. I mean, that's important contribution to the discussion about whatever it is. It's not the end result. I mean, I think this is the thing that we need to emphasize. You know, it's a component of the discussion. That's not saying this is the way that must be decided.
Thank you. Then we have another question here. It says the issue of labor seems crucial in all the area you have mentioned. For example, how we can measure value added change without the issue of labor.
I'm not quite sure what that means.
No.
Yeah. I think the studies that I've referred to in relation to creative labour, and they are different from the ones that Ellie referred to in the cultural studies area, and they both sort of complement each other. The ones that in cultural economics have looked particularly at the labour of artists and have extended to areas like, or to dimensions like the precariousness of labour, the situation in relation to creative, you know, careers in the creative arts and so on. And so to the extent that happens, I think that, you know, questions, the broader questions of value, even the questions of morals and ethics that Ellie referred to are taken into account.
Yeah. Maybe there's also another question, I think, that is related about what role do artists play in the making sense? So making sense about, yeah.
Yeah, Ellie will I'm sure we'll have a view on that, but let me just say very quickly that artists are fairly dangerous to bring into the policy-making process, because they're often completely sort of off the planet, which is a terrific thing and really important. But I'm only joking here, I have to say. We do need more. We do need really much more input from artists, who are the people who are working on the ground. And, you know, I mean, most of the work that I've done has been really to improve the notion of a career in the arts as a professional specialization, and not just something sort of dilettante activity. And so, you know, and in terms of things like, you know, the formation of cultural policy and the formation of arts policy, the views of artists are absolutely essential. I don't think there's any doubt about that. There is a question about how you bring it on board, and that's a question of sort of policy administration, and different countries and different governments have grappled with that with varying degrees of success. But I'd be interested to hear what Ellie thinks about that question.
I absolutely agree. I think that the perspective of cultural makers should be central, partly because ultimately the purpose of cultural policy in terms of financing, supporting the production of culture and then the consumption of culture is all about either supporting artists making arts and culture, and then supporting or facilitating people accessing the arts and culture that the artists make. So they are a very prominent concern and consideration in policy thinking, but I don't think that they are very much part of the policy debate process for various reasons, intentional, unintentional, I don't know. And I think there's that kind of problem that David mentioned about how do we bring their perspective in. But I found in my efforts to acknowledge that this was a missing element for cultural policy historically, is actually there are some challenges in bringing artists into policy debates. I remember doing a project called Dangerous Grounds, which was precisely about facilitating artists, the channeling the artists' views into debates around cultural value. And at one of these sort of public consultation with visual artists, a sculptor said, why should I be engaging with policymakers and articulating the value of what I do in language? My understanding of cultural value, my vision of cultural value is embodied in my sculptures. I'm not going to then devalue that work by turning it into prose, into language, into policy talk, which is not my thing. And that for me was light bulb moment, because I thought, you know what, he has a point. Why should we expect him to learn to engage with the language of policy making when he's already doing, he's already making his intellectual contribution? But at the same time, I thought he has a point, but that only means that that perspective will not feed into policy debates. And so it's a tricky one to navigate, that one. But I think it's part of the challenge ahead, that we need more presence of makers in policy discourse.
Yeah, we do. Thank you for your answers. I think we have time for one last question. Here's a question. The pandemic has made audience to connect to experience art and culture in different environments, meaning no live sessions, but all virtually. How do you expect this could have an impact on these two questions? And here they come. The care for culture and the capacity to promote development after the impacts the areas has suffered. Do you understand the questions?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of tried to answer that question by saying that I don't know whether this answers the question, but I'm not quite sure what the sort of the point really was there. But I think that, I was really saying that, yes, people change their consumption habits out of necessity because they don't have any choice during the pandemic. And that could perhaps expose people to new sorts of experiences that they hadn't had before. And that might increase the demand for, sort of stream music or whatever. And fine, I mean, this is the sort of thing that you would expect to happen, and tastes change and modes of delivery change over time, right through history. So I don't think, the pandemic, as I said before, I think the pandemic has hastened a lot of this to happen because it's happened sort of so suddenly, and then suddenly we're plunged into this world which we'd never really experienced before, and where some traditional modes of consumption are just and production are not available, and so we have to think of other things to do, and so we've done that. But when it's all over, and I hope that it will be all over at some point, it's very hard to see that at the moment, but it's you'd hope that it's coming somewhere. There are some elements that will still be constant, and I think that, as I mentioned before, the demand for direct engagement and contact between producer and consumer is something, or the produced output in the case of objects. This is something which won't be replaced, is going to continue.
And if I may add something, Johan, who asked the question, you might find interesting the work that the Centre for Cultural Value at the University of Leeds is doing in the UK. So I've mentioned they're doing COVID-19 sort of audience participation monitoring, and it's an ongoing process. So they publish regularly the interim findings. So my sense is that we don't have the full answer to your question yet, because the full impacts of cooperative participation are still unfolding. But one of the interesting things that are beginning to emerge from the UK picture is that the monitoring found that, unsurprisingly, everything going digital meant that more disabled people were engaging with cultural consumption than they did previously. And interestingly, also quite a significant increase in engagement from Black and ethnic minority publics, which perhaps suggests that, you know, they are willing to engage when they are safe in their homes and unlikely to be faced with racist behavior or, you know, racist environments. But another really interesting finding, which I think we will need to get our head around, is that they have also polled people for their intention to consume and asking them, you know, what are you going to do once it becomes possible to, once digital is no longer the only option. And a lot of people intend to engage more digitally. So clearly it's been a positive experience. So they will want to retain it even when they have other options. But the thing that I found really fascinating, and I don't really have an explanation, is the fact that in terms of intentions, a high percentage of people, and I can't remember the actual numbers now, but a significant proportion of people is planning to attend more local events. So somehow spending a year and a half being able to watch, you know, ballet from the New York City Ballet, or, you know, a year and a half where you can consume culture produced in all sorts of different places, has given people an appetite for the local, their immediate local. So I think that's an interesting finding. I'm not entirely sure what it means, but I think there'll be lots of interesting things to learn from this kind of data that I'm sure people are collecting in different contexts, in terms of both how do we care for artistic creation and for audiences, and also in terms of thinking about how do we sustain the sector. So I think we'll have to wait and see, I guess, is my answer.
Yes, but I think that would be a very positive development, actually, if people are more interested in the local supply and being more active in that sense. But yeah, as you said, we still have to wait and see what will happen. But,
yeah,
but
and also,
sure, something will change.
Exactly, and also I am not the one to be telling economists that, you know, what people say they will do and what people then will do when the possibility arises might not always be one and the same. So, you know, as you teach us, so we'll have, yeah, we'll see.
We will see, yes. But I think I need to end the session now. And thank you both for very interesting presentations. I think we have a very good debate and a lot to think about also during the next few days. There were a lot of important questions that were raised, and also questions we are not able to answer yet, but the time will show. And thank you also, Ellie, for inviting us to this special issue of cultural trends. I think that could be really exciting. If we could start working closer together across these two fields that until now have been, in my opinion, too separate.
I agree.
Because I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and also addressing some of these important questions we have discussed in this session.
Yeah, always happy to talk about that.
Great, thank you, and thank you again, both of you. And before we end the session, I just want to mention that here at 11 o'clock we have a feature at the conference site called Gather Town, where we can socially engage and talk to each other in the virtual space. Kind of, so it's a garden that you enter. It's very easy. But then we can walk around, and then suddenly I meet David Throsby, if you are in the space. And then when I meet you, our video shows, and we can have a private conversation. So it is like going around in the lunch break and and meeting a colleague and have a nice conversation about what is going on, and also the conference and the papers. So I really hope you will use this feature. It will be during the lunch breaks, and it will be by the end of the conference on Friday. And on that note, I just hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for listening.